not surprised to learn that we're advocating for today, because it's the whole theme of today, is to use video games as a possible model. So why would I want to do that, right? How would you arrive at video games as a model for all of this? After thinking all about learning theory, thinking all about technology, thinking all about what we understand about how people learn, which we've been talking about in the past, what's so great about games and what can we learn from them? So we're going to talk about that today in some detail. But first, I want to step out to an older technology. I want to step back to books. So books are a very common technology in education. Books are how most people have learned for hundreds of years. Now that they're very cheap and easy to pass around, we find books very commonly. They used to be much more precious, and in those situations, there might be one book, and the teacher would read, and the students would copy down what was read from the book, and that was how we practiced reading and writing. But books are problematic, and I'm going to give you an argument for that today. So this argument actually comes from someone named Steven Johnson, who's an author of many popular books. And this book he wrote is called Everything Bad is Good for You: How Popular Culture is Making Us Smarter. Has anybody read this book? It's a pretty good read. Actually, I got to know Steven is a few years younger than me, but he and I were in college together. And so I got to know him and his ideas pretty well as an undergrad. And this is a really interesting argument, which is that television today actually requires a much more engaged and thoughtful viewer than television of, say, 25 years ago. So 25 years ago, what were people watching? Well, we were watching shows like Dallas, and before that, maybe Gilligan's Island or The Brady Bunch. And the plot lines were really simple, like one thing happened at a time. Now we have shows like Lost, Breaking Bad. It's complicated. You have to, Game of Thrones. I can't even remember the characters in that show. So you have to really be engaged in tracking it. It almost takes, like you have to make a map of the characters to figure out what's going on. And the narrative levels are much higher. And it's actually really interesting to watch how people get very engaged in the narrative telling of these stories. So Stephen's argument is popular culture, as it gets more complicated, demands more of us. So it's actually making us smarter. And he makes the following argument about this old form of technology. So I'm going to read it directly from him because the quotes are good directly. So, reading books chronically understimulates the senses. Unlike the long-standing tradition of game playing, which engages the child in a vivid three-dimensional world filled with moving images and musical soundscapes, navigated and controlled with complex muscular movements, books are simply a barren string of words on the page. Books are also tragically isolating. While games have for many years engaged the young in complex social relationships with their peers, building and exploring worlds together, books force the child to sequester him or herself in a quiet space, shut off from interaction with other children. These new libraries that have arisen in recent years to facilitate reading activities are a frightening sight. Dozens of young children, normally so vivacious and socially interactive, sitting alone in cubicles, reading silently, oblivious to their peers. But perhaps the most dangerous property of these books is the fact that they follow a fixed linear path. You can't control their narratives in any fashion. You simply sit back and have the story dictated to you. This risks instilling a general passivity in our children, making them feel as though they're powerless to change their circumstances. Reading is not an active participatory process, it's a submissive one. The book readers of the younger generation are learning to follow the plot instead of learning to lead. Okay, book lovers, defend yourselves. Any response to that? Yes, Lauren.
I love books. And what about the idea that when you're reading, as you're reading, you're engaging and imagining what the story is telling you? So like reading Harry Potter versus going to see it at the movie. When I read it, I imagine vividly all of the characters and the places and what they look like. And then when I go to see a movie, I see somebody else's rendition.
Mm-hmm.
It's not mine.
Mm-hmm.
And so aren't I engaging on a lot of different levels there?
That's a good possible defense. Other possible defenses? Yes?
I think when you watch a movie, you're passive.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're reading a book, you're actively involved.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes back to imagining and connecting with the book. I'm a book lover.
Mm.
So.
Yeah, well, you book lovers are, it's good you guys are sitting together sort of over here.
I think there's also something to be said about the time frame in which content coming at you is done.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're reading, you can stop and say, whoa, I didn't get that. Let me read that again. Or you have kind you can game the content at your own speed. And with a movie, if something's going on, or even a video game, if something happens and you didn't see it, there's not as much response.
That's interesting. These are good defenses of the book in general. The book's probably not going away, so we're okay there, I think. I mean, bookstores maybe, but books not so much. What if I told you this was actually a passage that Stephen Johnson, he himself lifted directly from a critique of video games? So his point, actually, is that you could make this argument about any media, and people do make this argument about every media. Who's heard of the term moral panic? It was in our readings, I believe, so you've at least read it there. But every time there's a new medium introduced, including the book originally, there was a bit of a moral panic. Now, the moral panic when writing was introduced is a little less clear, but you remember on Week on My Greek Philosophers, one of them said the book will make us dumber, right? Because we won't have to remember things anymore. If we write it down, it doesn't force us to exercise our memories and our storytelling capabilities. So there was a kind of a panic about technology. The pulp novel in the 50s was thought to lead to the moral ruin of America's youth, of the world's youth. You know, on and on and on. Movies, again, you know, every time there's a new medium, people get very worried. You know, so what about the children? Is the constant refrain. And so this is an interesting thing to keep in mind when we read a lot of critiques about video games, including violent imagery, right? I mean, all the arguments about violent imagery in video games today is, it's funny that we don't have the argument at the same pitch around violent imagery in movies and television. I don't know why we don't have it at the same pitch. The violence is equally the same. And we are not going to talk a lot about violence in video games today. I'll mention it in some context, and you can feel free to raise background discussion on it on the question tool, and we can continue, or even just ask questions about it. But my point today is not to focus on the possible panics, but rather to focus on the plausible promise, right? The things that we could get from video games that would help us focus on learning. Questions about this? Everything Bad is Good for You. It's actually a pretty good read. Pretty quick read. All right, so I think we need to define something first, right? We need to agree on a definition of games. So this is a pretty good working definition. It comes from someone named Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman. They are very well-regarded game designers. Katie Salen has also gone on to found a school called Quest to Learn. We'll talk about Quest to Learn at the end. So she has herself been deeply engaged in educational design as a part of her work. And some of her games are like Diner Dash. I mean, very well-known sort of game environments. And she's also done a lot of work with sort of big alternative reality games where, you know, you change the world as you play. So here's their definition. So a game is a system in which players engage in an artificial conflict defined by rules that results in a quantifiable outcome. So now I want to break this down by the highlighted words and think about some of these things in terms of school, right, or in terms of learning environments. So first, a system, an interconnection of objects, attributes, relationships, all within an environment. Well, that defines all organized workplaces, learning places, social places, right? These systems are what binds us together and helps us know what we're doing together in those spaces. So clearly this definition, as it applies to a game, also applies to a school. Anything without this is just chaos, right? It's just people milling about. Players, you need one or more participants who interact with or within the system to experience the play of the game. Okay, also true for learning. It doesn't need to be a classroom full of people. It could be a single person by themselves working in a tutorial mode or studying a book, or it could be multiple people working together or learning together as part of a classroom. Artificial, there's some kind of a boundary between the game world and the real world. I had a lot of, come on in, welcome. I had a lot of debates in college with a girlfriend at the time about whether we were actually in the real world or just practicing for the real world in college. And I was on the it's the real world side, like how could it get any realer than this? I was kind of an idiot. And I think she's actually right in the long run because there is something artificial about the learning environment. We protect the people in the environment in some very specific ways so they can try ideas out. And so they aren't subject to all of the buffeting and vicissitudes of the real world. So that space is constrained, right? I mean, the biggest shock to me when I actually started working in the real world was, what, I don't get Thanksgiving, Christmas, and the summer off? No, that's not how it works in the real world. It goes all year. Conflict, a contest of powers. This can take a lot of different forms, and it can be solo, it can be group. So certainly, I think all learning involves a conflict. We sometimes talk about cognitive conflict, right? But it's a competition between you and the material which demands to be learned. Maybe it's an external competition, like you and a test you have to take, or a paper that has to be evaluated. But there's some kind of a conflict or contest involved in games and in many, many learning situations. And I'm defining that broadly here, right? It doesn't have to be something that's artificially tested. It could be something that's simply you want to demonstrate mastery and proficiency, and so that's the contest. That's the conflict, is for you to master that material. There are rules. Without rules, it might still be play, but it's not going to be a game. And anybody who's interacted a lot with, say, a 3-year-old understands this, right? You know, when they're making up the rules as they go and you don't really know where they're headed. That's not a game. That is play. Play is great. A lot of what we're going to talk about today applies equally well to play as it does to formal games. But having rules in that structure is what makes it a game, right? So that we all know what the rules are and we can act and interact with and around the rules. And a quantifiable outcome. So when a game is over, there's some kind of a win or loss state. You sort of know where you stand at least. And that's really important too, because something where there's not a win or loss state is, again, play, perfectly good, but not necessarily a game. Questions about these aspects of the definition? Anything people want to expand upon? People who think a lot about games? Matthew?
I think the game has to include choices.
Choices? Okay.
So, for instance, I don't believe Candyland is a game because the players don't actually choose anything. It's all random.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no options. So I think a game has to include options.
So that's possible, although maybe that's contained within one of these other things. Like maybe that's just within the rules, right? That we either agree there are choices or not.
Maybe.
But that's a personal preference, is that you're looking for games where you have consequential choice. You have to decide to do something. Other things we may want to think about? Okay, well, let's move on and think about boundary cases, right? Whenever you define something, the first thing you should do is try to think about what stretches your definition, right? What are the things on the edge that test this? And there are two particular boundary cases that I want to introduce for you today. One are these role-playing games, so World of Warcraft or other massively multiplayer games, or the sort of the card or table-based games like Dungeons and Dragons. They don't seem to have quantifiable outcomes. So they test the definition in some way. Life doesn't really have a quantifiable outcome, right? It goes on and on and on. But the point in both is that there are usually, in the game world, we might call them sub-quests, right? So they're shorter term activities you engage in that do have some kind of an outcome, so you know where you stand. And then as things go on, you go through a series of these quests. So in the special case of the role-playing game, it's the sub-quests that are the quantifiable outcome. Puzzles are another boundary case, right? So how many people here like to do crossword puzzles? I do one every morning. Anyone who does crossword puzzles? Ellen, you ever do the same crossword puzzle twice? Yeah, why would you? Right? After you solved it, you've solved it. Everything after that is not fun. So a puzzle is a game, but it's not replayable, right? Because it has one known answer. After you've accomplished it, that's it. That puzzle's done. You need a new puzzle, right? It could be the same form, but it's going to be a slightly different puzzle. Okay. This is a distinction I like a lot. It comes from a guy who was writing for The New Yorker. But it's about entertainment versus play, because we're not necessarily talking, I also want to make this distinction. Entertainment, so we're talking about movies or other things, are things you take in, and play is something you participate in, right? So that's part of my definition of two, is that in order for it to be a game, really, it's something that has to invite you to participate in it, or it has to create the opportunity for you to participate in it. And you can, by the way, do that as a spectator also, right? So you would argue that people who watch sports are engaged, right? They're participating in some way. And in fact, the better the participation experience, the better the experience, right? If you feel too isolated. That's why people go to sports bars to watch games instead of watching at home by themselves. It's just better to be around other people. It creates a more participatory experience. All right, so there are three ways we're going to think about games today. We're going to think about games as good learning environments. We're going to get into that next. So that'll be the first topic we deal with. because they're good, they leverage good learning theory. So that's the G reading that you were thinking about, and we'll unpack that and add to it. Then we're going to think about playing games in school and so-called educational games. And then finally, we're going to think about making school more game-like. So first, let's think about the principles behind what makes games really good learning environments. And this comes, so Jim G was a starting point for me in thinking about this. So not the piece you read, but there's a longer book for those of you who found his ideas interesting, called What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning and Literacy. I actually saw Jim last week. He's one of the people at Arizona State. He moved to Arizona State. He was at Wisconsin when he developed a lot of these ideas. One of you posted on the blog about Kurt and Constance Steinkuhler and Kurt Squire's current MOOC on games and learning. Jim G is in that as a frequent guest talking about principles. It's actually, I'm signed up for that MOOC too. I recommend it. It's an interesting and not terribly time-consuming way to examine some of these ideas if you find them really interesting. And it's a pretty well-designed MOOC as far as MOOCs go. So I may bring some examples from that class forward when we talk about MOOCs in a few weeks. But there's more than just G in here. So this is sort of my boiling down a lot of different things I've been reading and thinking about over the years and trying to mix it together. And I've sort of boiled it down to these 10 principles that I think are a good way to think about what makes games good learning environments. Now, why is the word good in quotes? Because there are, of course, games that are not good learning environments, or games that are very limited in the way they're learning environments. So first of all, people who do work in this area will claim that any successful commercial game is, by rule, a good learning environment, because we're learning animals. And if we aren't engaged, if we don't feel like we're always learning, then we'll stop doing something. We'll either be frustrated or bored, and we won't continue with that activity unless we're forced to in some way. You're not forced to play most games, so you will stop playing it, and that game, if enough people find the same thing to be true, the game will be a failure in the marketplace. So there's that underlying theory of what makes a game a good game, and G talks about games like Pikmin or Call of Duty, or I mean lots of sort of these big expansive games that give you a lot of things to learn and a lot of things to master. There are also games that are very, very successful but fall outside my definition of good. So for instance, Angry Birds, Candy Crush, Bejeweled, right? These games actually use motivational design to keep you engaged in a very effective, almost crack-like way. But they don't really take you anywhere, right? There isn't much benefit to get out of them. They're little mini diversions. For as long as you engage with them, you're diverted from whatever else you were doing or thinking about or conversation you were having. And that's about it, right? So they're sort of outside of the realm of what we're talking about today also, because they're for a lot of reasons. And when you see the principles, you'll see and you'll think, yeah, those games don't stand up very well against these principles. So they're successful, but for a different reason. And they tend to not be good learning games also. I mean, when we talk about learning in school. So okay, we'll come. And if you have counterexamples, by the way, feel free to raise them. I'm going to show you a very famous example later of a game that is sort of in that vein, that has been very successful and I think is a bad learning game at the same time. So first, these are the first principle. Any good learning environment has clear goals. You know what you're getting into at the beginning. Now, it could well be that there's a bait and switch, and somewhere in the middle you're actually learning something that you didn't realize you'd be learning. That's fine, but you hardly ever enter into something without some idea of why you're entering into it, right? You don't register for a class with absolutely no idea what that class is going to be about. Sometimes in school, of course, kids don't have much choice, so they just get pushed through. That's a design problem for school. But in the best sense, sort of people know what they're signing up for, and they know what they're getting into. So all good games use a mix of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Now later on, we're going to talk in some detail about motivation. And there's a general feeling in the world, you hear people talk this way a lot, that intrinsic motivation is good and extrinsic motivation is not as good. And I'll actually say that in all good game design and probably all good learning design, you can't have one without the other. It takes some mix of these things. So that maybe it's the extrinsic motivators, and I'll define this for you a little bit later. I'll define it in more detail, but maybe the extrinsic motivators are what gets you engaged in the first place. The lure of a reward or a prize, or maybe because other people are urging you to do it because they want you to have the same experience they've had. But then as you go on in a well-designed experience, the motivation should shift to become something more intrinsic and something more about what you're interested in, and that's what will keep you engaged in the experience. Number 3, this principle and the next 2 actually are related to a motivational theory that I think is very important called self-determination theory. And we'll talk more about that too later. But the first principle from self-determination theory is that people need autonomy. So this is to what Matthew was saying before about choice. You have to be able to make choices, and they have to be consequential. You have to feel like you're in control, feel like being the key thing. Maybe you're not really in control, but you have to have at least the illusion of control. And actually, again, back to the 2- and 3-year-olds, or a little bit older, anybody had to get a little kid dressed for school in the morning, or dressed for anything? So parents, which is the better thing to say? What would you like to wear today? It's a terrible thing to say. The better thing is to say, do you want to wear this outfit, or do you want to wear this outfit? Right? You're completely controlling that choice, but the kid still feels like they're making a choice, and that it's a consequential choice. So that's good. That gives a sense of motivation and makes the person want to go along. You'll learn that one the hard way. Belonging is very important. So people have to feel like they're in it with other people, or in it as part of some group. So again, you want to feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself. So that can be accomplished through collaboration, through competition, but this notion that we're on some shared journey is very, very important. A really well-designed game makes you feel competent, right? Like there's often these leveling systems and self-adjusting systems. So at no point in the game will you feel either bored or frustrated. Now, you may temporarily feel frustrated or challenged, but a good game will recognize this and try to give you the opportunity to learn, go practice a skill you need a little bit more. Maybe it'll make it a little bit easier for you for a little while. And likewise, it will make it much harder for you if it sees you're having too easy of a time. This is what more advanced design does. It's what really good learning environments should do also. This is about individualizing instruction, right? Is trying to adjust things up and down. Lowered risk of failure and productive failure. This is one of the most important things. So we'll spend a little bit of time thinking about it. So if there were a game where when you died, you had to go all the way back to the beginning of the game, you probably wouldn't play that game very much. There actually is an example if you want to play with it. It's one of my favorite iPhone games. It's called One Life. I think you can still download it, but it's free, so it's not a scam. But you play One Life, and the mission in One Life is to jump from one building to another. And you get to practice as much as you want. And then once you make the jump, if you miss, the game locks up, and the only way to keep playing is to delete it and re-download it from the App Store. One Life. It's terrible. It's also sort of artistic and beautiful in a way. So go check it out, right? It is free. And it's an art commentary on what games let you do is never really die, right? You can keep going forever and ever and ever. School is kind of like that game, often. So think about the way the education system is designed right now, especially for people who end up at places like Michigan. Right? In order to win at a level that lets you get to Michigan, you pretty much have to win every level below. Right? You have to get A's in your classes. You have to do well on your standardized tests. You have to do well on your essays and there's not a moment at which you're allowed to fail and try again. Now, there are sometimes things you can do. You can have do-overs and try things more than once, but it's very rare. So high school, really all of school is a process of trying to achieve at the highest level to make sure that you never fail. And that's a huge problem for a couple of reasons. One of which is that applying to college, or high school used to be thought of as preparation for going to college, but now high school has become preparation for applying to college. Right? And that's sort of a breakdown of what high school is for, and it's made it a lot harder to do interesting things in high school. The other problem is it creates really brittle people who don't know how to fail. One thing I'm trying to teach my children right now is that it's okay to get a bad grade, right? That you shouldn't, for instance, make choices about what classes you want to take based on what you think the grade will be in them, right? But that's how people make choices. Actually, there are whole advising systems now designed to help people pick easier classes that they can keep their GPA up in. And we don't have one of those systems here at Michigan, but I'm sure that we have an informal system for doing that, where people advise each other on what the guts are, right? That's what we call an easy class, a gut. This is because people realize that even here, if you want to get into grad school or medical school, you better have a high GPA. So people find ways to make that happen because we don't allow failure. What's really sad about this is if you talk to most truly successful people, so think about entrepreneurs, right, or people who started Silicon Valley businesses. They're the rare Zuckerbergs of the world who sort of stumble their way into something huge right away. But most people, the vast majority, 99.99%, will tell you a story of how they made mistakes and failed over and over and over and over again on their way to the thing that worked. And what they're doing is they're learning along the way. Right? There's a very important learning theory that a lot of artificial intelligence uses called failure-driven learning, right? Where you get something wrong and then you sort of learn from what you got wrong as you build towards getting things right. A lot of the cognitive tutors work on that principle. We'll be talking about them later too. So I have a different way of thinking about this. You know, this idea of win some, lose some, I think is a little bit counterproductive. What you really want is win some, learn some, right? So the idea is to lose a lot. Actually, if you visit Henry Jenkins' lab, we'll hear a quote from Henry Jenkins in a little while. He's at USC, and all over his lab are signs that say, actually, I think these signs originate at Facebook. They say things like, fail harder, right? So he really wants people to try something really ambitious and get it wrong, because they'll learn more from that than only doing things they know they can get right. Right? You're not stretching yourself. Think about Vygotsky and that zone of proximal development. Right? The key thing there is to push yourself to the outer limits of what you can do. And if you're really doing that, it means you're going to screw up a lot, and that's okay. Next principle. In part, if we enable people to fail safely, then we allow them to explore more, to understand more. We encourage that. And if you watch a gamer engage with the game world, you'll notice that when an avid gamer gets to the end of a level, they often don't just go on to play the next level. They go replay, right? They work their way through. They try to look at all the things they didn't see the first time, looking for the hidden doorways, the hidden passages, the stars or rewards they missed the first time through. But they're not just sort of collecting swag. What they're also doing is exploring the game system, right? Sometimes you'll watch a gamer see how many different ways they can die. They get their character to die. That's important, right? Because what you're doing is you're exploring the system. Much of math and science, and even literature, I will argue, is about exploring systems, right? Trying to understand the interconnections of ideas and how they work. And a really successful science learner is someone who understands not just the cookbook recipe for doing the lab, but what the elements of the lab are that make it really work together, and what you can test and push and tweak and to make interesting things happen around the edges. So that's a successful outcome. It comes from exploring, right? Not just from learning the very thin pathway that you're taught to do. Identity play, this is one that G raises directly, and it's one of his most important, and I think very important overall, that when you are, ideally in school, back to science, what we're doing is not just teaching people about science, but we're teaching people about how scientists think, right? And how to think like a scientist. We're not trying to make them into little scientists in school, but we are trying to get them to understand a scientific perspective. A history educator here at Michigan, Bob Bain, talks a lot about the importance of not teaching the facts of history, but teaching the process of history, right? Because there are lots of facts in history, and there are different sides, different collections of facts. But what's important is to understand how a historian weighs evidence, how they consider sources, how they make arguments and support those arguments in order to arrive at a story, a narrative about history. And that's much more important to him than actually being able to recite dates in history, say, or famous people in history. The two go together, it turns out. You learn both at the same time very effectively. But you see history in a very different way. In a game, Jim G talks about tripartite identity. And what he means by that is there's you playing the game, there's the character on the screen that you're controlling in the game, and then there's this interesting mix between the two. And anybody has experienced this if, for instance, how many of you have played games like Pac-Man, Ms. Pac-Man, right? When Pac-Man or Ms. Pac-Man gets eaten by a ghost, how do you feel? like you've let Pac-Man down, right? It's kind of your fault. And that's a part of this tripartite identity. And same thing, people get very invested, especially in the narrative games, very invested in their characters. And feel badly if they have to make their character do something they think is morally wrong, say. Right? I mean, that can be a very interesting idea. And a lot of really successful games let you play the game from multiple perspectives. So play as a good guy, play as a bad guy. You know, play it more than one time. In order to examine the world from these different perspectives. That's a really intriguing idea. Number 9. This is especially true of video games more than any other kind of game. But one of the most durable findings in cognitive science is the practice effect, that you practice a lot to get good at something. Malcolm Gladwell made this very popular a few years ago, talking about the 10,000 hours that it takes to develop expertise in a particular area. Well, 10,000 hours is a very long time. It turns out a lot of gamers put in 10,000 hours over the course of growing up till they get out of high school. But a video game doesn't get tired of you. It doesn't say, enough already with the running and jumping practice, right? Or go outside. Maybe it should. But the point is, a video game lets you practice as much as you want, as repetitively as you want. It lets you really hone your skills as much as you want. It'd be great if school were like that. But school, because we're driven by tests and standards, try to force everyone sort of along at roughly the same pace. And that creates difficulty because not everybody learns at the same pace. So this ability of games to let people move at their own pace and practice as much as they want is really interesting. Finally, another one of my favorites, embedded assessment. So when somebody finishes playing a complex video game, say Halo is the example that's often used here, you wouldn't give them a test on Halo. Because they've just demonstrated they can do Halo, right? It'd be like if at the end of the football game, we quick gave all the players a written quiz to make sure they understood all the rules. You know, well, no, they've just been involved in this. Some of them don't seem to understand the rules, but that's okay. That's a part of that game. In this case, we want to design the gameplay experience so that we believe that at the end of every level, the player has learned what they need to know to be successful in the next level. And there's sort of a built-in examination of that, right? Which is you'll start to fail a lot more if you didn't pay enough attention at the earlier levels. That's part of why gamers examine the space so well. And when they get stuck at an earlier level, a good strategy is go back and practice some more at a lower level. So what do we do in school? Well, in school, everything is tested by stopping the activity. Actually, there's a good metaphor for this. It comes from the National Ed Tech Plan. I think we talked about it when we were talking about that, right? This inventory metaphor. That in schools, we not only close the store to take inventory, but we close the store to practice to take inventory. So that's a terrible waste of time. And what we should do is think in learning, how could we embed the assessment of the learning more in the actual activity of the learning? And what would that demand of us to redesign learning? So those are the 10. Questions about any of those? Well, let's pause for a moment and think about what people might actually learn from playing a complex video game. So this comes from one of the world's most accurate news sources, of course, The Onion.
Skills that they'll need after the apocalypse, like finding shotgun ammo and leading elite squads of super soldiers.
But these aren't the advanced skills that they're going to need. They're going to need the more practical skills, like how to build a shelter from abandoned cars, or how to find drinking water by collecting the morning dew in human skulls.
Or how to deal with depression when the sun is blocked out for 500 years by a cloud of radioactive dust.
Absolutely. Now, that's the type of knowledge these kids are going to need when their world has been turned into a brutal hellscape.
But these games don't have to be an accurate depiction of a post-apocalyptic world. They just need to teach the basic concepts, which they do. 72% of kids said that they know how to find items to barter at weapon shops and how to use medicine packs to heal zombie bites with these video games.
That's excellent to know. The game Fallout 3 has taught my son Charlie that it's easier to kill cyborgs with a grenade than a machine gun.
Games make it all seem deceptively simple. I mean, in the future, a kid's not going to be able to kill a 6-foot-long irradiated beetle just by pressing a few buttons. And he's going to have to get down there with an axe and hack and hack and hack.
David, our kids are going to have the rest of their lives to get actual experience in how to desperately fight for survival. survival.
Exactly. What's important is that we teach our children the fundamentals now so that they can be successful in whatever nightmare scenario that they may find themselves in.
Well, if they survive that
Of
long.
course, another flaw with these games is that most kids will become mutants themselves once the apocalypse hits.
It's a huge problem.
I think that it's a chance that we're going to have to take. Playing video games all day, alone and friendless, is simply the best way that we have to prepare our children for a life of solitude and a barren
Yes.
wasteland.
Moving on, many of today's
It's a huge problem.
I think that it's a chance that we're going to have to take. Playing video games all day, alone and friendless, is simply the best way that we have to prepare our children for a life of solitude and a barren wasteland.
I like that a lot. I like the way they really nail the tone of these shows, too. But that's, okay, that's a take, actually. If you take all these principles very literally and interpret them to their logical, silly extreme, that is probably what you would find. But that's talking about real video games and, of course, commercial video games, which you can learn from. But there are other things you can learn from games that are designed specifically for education. But that's just one more thing about commercial video games. This is work of John Seely Brown, frequently cited in this class, famous alumnus of the University of Michigan, strong supporter of the School of Information. So John Seely Brown and colleagues, Doug Thomas in particular, are doing research on people who play World of Warcraft. Anyone here play World of Warcraft? Similar kind of games? No, you people have more to do, so good. One of the things that is true in a game like World of Warcraft is that you have to build a team. You have to build what they call a guild. And this is a guild that goes questing together. And in order to build a guild, you need to assemble people with different kinds of skills. So you might need warriors, you might need healers, you might need spellcasters. You just need people with different kinds of skills because the quests often need different things, and no single character can have all those skills. You often include, as someone building a team, very experienced players and newer players, or newbies as they're called. There's sort of this cycle of we talked about the community of practice idea earlier. The community of practice idea is alive and well in a lot of these games, where you learn on the edges sort of how to do a simple thing repeatedly until you can show that you have more skill and then sort of level up and eventually be a leader. So John Seely Brown and Doug Thomas have been studying people who play these games, and they believe they make pretty good management material. Right? That if you're someone who knows how to organize a guild of players who represent different skill sets and manage those varying skill sets toward a successful outcome, that is a pretty good head start on what a lot of managing a complex project in the real world is going to require. So pretty interesting idea. There's, by the way, a really great book by Cory Doctorow called For the Win. So anyone here who likes Cory Doctorow, his books are all available for purchase, which he very much appreciates, but also for free if you wish to download as PDFs or as other digital ebook formats. And For the Win is a book about the economics of these massively multiplayer games, and it kind of gets inside the world of these games and the globalization of these games in a very intriguing way. But this is an argument made by a cognitive psychologist who I think is unassailable in his credentials about what people might learn that is applicable in the real world from playing one of these fantasy world games. Okay, we're going to switch to that is things you can learn from commercial games. But let's start talking about the special category of games now, educational games. So games that are designed explicitly to be played in school, right, which is a very different kind of thing. As we read about in that article by Kelly et al. This week, it's a hard process to design these games. Not necessarily easier than designing a successful commercial game, but different, because you've got to blend together real content knowledge, right, and real learning knowledge, and real assessment knowledge with the actual gameplay and making it fun kind of knowledge. And as we'll see, that's not always so easy to do. But in common parlance, this next example is an educational game. All right, ridiculous? Often not. The Simpsons is usually accurate. Here is a version of that game. Yes, Chris has played Math Blaster. How many other people have played Math Blaster? Yeah, The majority of you have played Math Blaster. So let me tell you about Math Blaster. So Math Blaster is a game, there are various versions of it. This is a version from the mid-90s. In this version, you have to shoot at trash that equals whatever the math equation down here is. So shoot at things that equal 5. Good work. And you do this for a while, and you're practicing your addition skills. And if you do it for long enough, you get a reward, which is that you get to fly around space and just shoot at stuff. So this is the general idea of these games, right? You practice a skill for a little while, and then you get to do something more traditionally game-like. All right, show of hands. How many of you believe that Math Blaster is an effective way to learn math? 1, 2, 3.5, 4, 5. I think it's pretty effective, guys. I mean, come on. First of all, I already told you that practice is extremely important, right? And so Math Blaster lets you practice your basic math facts over and over and over again in a way that might actually, be more palatable than just doing worksheets over and over and over again. So I would argue that Math Blaster and its ilk are effective educational games when it comes to practicing those skills. But they also have another unexpected thing that they teach. Who can think what that might be? What would be the hidden lesson in Math Blaster? Zach knows the answer. Zach?
Get past the math part, the part where you can shoot anything.
Get past the math part as fast as possible. Yes, this kind of game design inadvertently teaches you to not like math, because math is the thing that stands between you and the thing you came here to do, which is shoot at asteroids or aliens or whatever. Right? So the hidden message here is take your medicine first, and then you can have some fun. Eat your vegetables, whatever the metaphor is that you wish, right? So that's a problematic thing in their design, and something that doesn't get talked about very often, but I think is key to keep in mind. All right, so another one, slightly better. This game is called Dimension, and it is an algebra first-person shooter used to some success in the New York City public schools, and this is sort of a trailer for it.
A hybrid virus, half biological, half digital. A hybrid virus, half biological, half digital. They say my father's slain. Now they're after me. Soon they'll come after you.
Now what is it you want?
It's definitely on a continuum toward better. Why is it better? Well, it's better because it's embedding the math activity in the activity of the game more directly, right? Shooting at math, at trash in space that happens to have the sum or the dividend or the, whatever the other mathy terms are for things that you multiply or divide or subtract, that's not very authentic, right? It's like wildly inauthentic. In this case, using a coordinate grid system to, navigate around, that's more authentic. That is a regular part of the gameplay that you would expect to have in a game. There are parts of this that aren't authentic either, right? There's a huge fantasy overlay here that you have to buy into. Is this game going to appeal equally well to all players? I don't know. I imagine not, right? It may, and I mean, you pick your dividing line, right? Gender, age. There could be lots of different ways that this game might appeal differently to different players. It has been pretty successful in New York City public schools in terms of getting kids excited about sort of tournaments around this game, and one school competes against another, all of which are useful design attributes, but a little bit outside of the math learning itself. So it's promising. yet still somewhat problematic, right? But I think there are lots of things that we're going to look at in this class that are promising or problematic, and I wouldn't not do them because they're problematic, right? I'd think about ways to design around the problematic parts and ways to mitigate the problematic parts. So pretty good. This is another game which, well, before we get to another example, first, this is now, I mentioned vegetables before, so here's a vegetable metaphor for you. And you've all looked at the slides, so you know it's coming up here, but the people at home don't. So first, this is how we see games, right? So games are like an ice cream sundae, all pleasure. And this is how we see learning, like spinach. I happen to like spinach. I like cream spinach a lot. I like it in certain contexts more than others. For instance, I don't go to the movie theater and ask for a Diet Coke and cream spinach, right? Or at the amusement park or whatever. I tend to like my spinach in very specialized settings. Unfortunately, this is what a lot of educational games end up being like, a spinach sundae. So this is an old metaphor. There are other metaphors too that people use, like chocolate broccoli, which actually sounds not terrible to me. But this metaphor comes from this guy I mentioned before, Henry Jenkins, who's now at University of Southern California. He used to be at MIT. He's done a lot of great work on sort of fan culture and fan fiction, acaculture he calls it. And he's also done a lot of thinking about what makes games so engrossing for lots of people. And his critique of educational games is essentially what you can read here for yourself, but that it takes such a diverse set of skills. So this is the Kelly et al. Article that we read, talked about this too. Such a diverse set of skills have to be brought together to make a successful game in the education space, or in any space for that matter, that it's hard to find the right mix of people. And a lot of the educational games you'll see are designed by people whose main experience with learning was as learners, sometimes as teachers. But hardly ever do you find a mix of people who are really good game designers, because designing a play experience is somewhat different than designing a learning experience, or really good educators. So as he puts it, edutainment games often have all the entertainment value of a bad game and all the educational value of a bad lecture. So that's, I think, that applies to the two examples we saw. Here's a better example. Who played this game? The Logical Journey of the Zumbinis. Adam did. Anyone else play the Zumbinis games? Okay, so this game, the audio is a little bit annoying, so turn it down a little bit.
Cliffs play by certain rules. What one cliff accepts, the other rejects. Look for one feature, such as a red nose, that does not cause an allergic reaction.
So this is a game where you assemble a set of Zumbinis with different characteristics, and then there's sort of these logic puzzles where you have to get the Zumbinis on their quest. There's a long-term quest. And you lose Zumbinis along the way. By the way, if you lose them all, you don't have to go back to the beginning. You sort of get Zumbini reinstatement. But you have to deduce what the right principles are. How this game came about was because its designer, a fellow named Scott Osterweil, was messing around with just databases and set theory. He was at the time working at a place called Turk, which is in Boston. They do a lot of great math and science curriculum work and design work. Well, we'll skip over that. So Scott's rule is to find the game in the content. So he designed these Zumbini characters, and he was designing it so that people could play around with database and arrays. And he realized that his kids would just love playing around with the Zumbinis and like making them look all different kinds of ways and seeing how many different combinations of Zumbinis they could make. Observing this, he realized that that's actually the game. Right? The game is sort of combining things in databases and understanding how features relate to each other. And so he had developed this idea, you do far better when you find the game in the content rather than lay content in a game, but sort of mash them together. So an example of matching content in a game together is Math Blaster. Oh, we have a spaceflight shooting game. So we're going to make a spaceflight shooting game about math because kids like spaceflight. And so we need them to like math. Dimension, same problem. You know, a first-person algebra shooter. Oh, kids like first-person shooters, so we're going to sort of mash them together. A game like Zumbinis is not a genre that is very common, right? It's a puzzle game. We have that genre now, but it's not sort of trying to slam two things together. It's looking for what naturally goes together. And Scott has a long career, actually, of designing really great games. One that is one of my favorites now is called The Lure of the Labyrinth. And you can have a chance to play one of these games in a moment. But Labyrinth is a game designed aligned with middle school math standards. originally in Maryland, but they align well with the Common Core as well. It has a lot of great features. So for instance, it begins with a story. The storyline in Labyrinth is that you have a pet, you get to create your own profile, so there's some identity play in it, right? So you create a character, you pick the colors that the character wears, the kind of creature the character is, you pick your pet and you name your pet. It's actually a very constrained choice again because it's a web-based flash game, but it gives you some sense of control. And the idea is that your pet is kidnapped out of a pet store while you're in buying its favorite pet food, Tasty Pet. And you follow sort of the sound of your pet being kidnapped, and you fall into a pit. This is sort of the kidnapping theme. And you realize that your pet has been taken into the Tasty Pet food factory. And the mission, the long-term mission, is to rescue your pet and in fact set all these other pets free. There's sort of a Soylent Green sub-theme here. But don't worry, in the end it's not so gruesome because the kids didn't like that and they've made it sort of a happier thing in the end. You were faced with a series of challenges. So here's one. This is a game that you could play online in a moment where you have to figure out how to feed these. You're sort of masquerading as a cafeteria worker at one point in this game, and you have to figure out what to feed these different creatures, what they want on their tray. Now, we're not going to play this game live in class, but this is really a ratio and proportionality game. Because the ratios are the same. And it's possible to discover the ratio as you go by experimenting and by forming a theory of what, okay, so they have this much spiky hamburger and they have this much green glop, 1 to 5. So that means that if there's 8 green glop here, whatever goes here is probably going to be, well, 60, right? No, wait, 8 times 5, 40, right? Thank you. So you learn how to mix how this mixes together. Oh, wait, that couldn't be right. No, it could be right. Yes, because see, these two equal each other also. The blue chicken or tastes like chicken, and the spiky hamburger are both the same. So 40 and 40. So you deduce these things as you go. Now, some kids just happily play the game and don't worry too much about what the math is. Other kids sort of see the math. So my kids each learned how to play this game early on, in part because I'm friends with Scott and they were testing it. And my older daughter said, "Oh, this is awesome, I really like this." My younger daughter said, she's sort of, she's sneaky herself, so she understands sneakiness inherently. She said, "Hey, this is math. You can't trick me." And so she didn't choose to keep engaging with the game at that moment. But the point is really an interesting one for how this game is designed, which is it doesn't matter if you think of it as a math game or not. Your goal is to free the pets. My younger daughter did like that idea, or she did like that idea. And you learn a lot of other things as you go. So for instance, all of the characters in the game are real, or real mythological, right? So this is, I never know how to pronounce this. Is it Kerberos? Cerberus? But I think it's also Kerberos sometimes. So like our authentication system at the university is Kerberos, right? And that's named for these 3 guys who are dogs. Some of you may recognize them from the first Harry Potter book / movie. But this is a mythological character who guards the gates of hell, I think. Thank you. And you could read all that here. So once guarded the gates of the underworld, but now keeps watch over the Tasty Pet factory. Kids, so anyone here read the, I forget the guy's name, there's sort of this Greek mythology series. Rick Riordan, thank you. And what's the character's name? Percy Jackson. So the second movie's coming out soon, I think. But my younger daughter, professed not to want to play this game because it was math, loves the Rick Riordan books, and in a random conversation about mythological characters, knows all the Greek gods, right? So that's really cool. It's this idea that it's easier to, you can learn a lot of things all at once if the context is right. And a lot of those things that you learn stick with you as you go. So this game's really well designed in that respect. And it's also well designed for educators. So there's a link you can go to that explains how teachers might use this game. And this is the most interesting part for me. This game is not necessarily meant to be played in class. It's meant to be assigned to be played during the summer or outside of class whenever kids want. There's a dashboard where teachers can see what progress their kids are making through the game. The idea of the game is that there are roughly 12 sub-games, 12 different kinds of sub-games. They have different levels of difficulty. And those 12 sub-games are tied to 12 challenging topics in the middle school math curriculum. The teacher doesn't have to change how they teach math at all, except when they introduce a new topic, they can say to the class, you may think this is all new for you, but you've in fact already solved problems exactly like these. And then pull up the game, show them, because they know what progress the kids have made, show them how the problem in the game maps onto the problem in the textbook. So it becomes a translational issue, and the whole idea is to reduce math anxiety. Right? So this is I've already exhibited to you today some of my latent math phobia. And a big part of it for me was every time we got to a new chapter in the textbook, it would start over with a new topic, and that was a new chance for me to be a dummy, right? And so every chapter was like that for me. It was like, oh, another thing I'm not going to be able to understand. It will get worse as we went. This design is meant to, both you can learn some math from doing it, but you also can reduce your anxiety about math because you already know you can do it. And the teacher's task then becomes translating from the game language of math to the formalism of math as it's represented in math textbooks. And this guide here at this website actually has hints on how to do that. And it's like a concordance. It relates the games to the math standards and the math curricula. So that to me is a super interesting idea. Matthew?
Well, the real problem there is that you said they do it over the summer break, for instance.
They could. Mm-hmm.
And in most schools, the teacher doesn't know who their students are going to be, so the school would have to be all on board, and that seems...
Well, but often if you get on board as a school, then everyone can be assigned it, or it can be assigned as homework during the school year. There are lots of ways to approach it.
Sure.
The main thing is that the argument they're making here, this is a very Cuban-friendly argument. If you're watching this on video, we're not talking about The Nation. We're talking about Larry Cuban, who is a critic of educational technology. This first of all doesn't require the teacher to necessarily change anything about their teaching practice, which is a win, right? Because it leaves control of how the game is played to the teacher. It doesn't say, now we will play this game, and that's what our curriculum will be, is you'll play this game for 3 weeks. Dimension, pretty much, especially because it's played in urban settings frequently and has a high demand on the video capabilities of the computer, has to be played in the school computer lab, and so that has to become the math curriculum, which is problematic. Labyrinth doesn't. Now, it gets subverted in lots of interesting ways, and there's not been a study done of this yet. I actually wrote a proposal with Scott Osterweil to study this, but it didn't get funded. So sometimes teachers make choices about how to implement the game in ways that undermine some of the power of the designer's intention. So for instance, we've observed teachers project the game and play it in unison with their class. So that is not ideal because then it becomes sort of a call and answer thing, and you can't really explore and you can't really build your own character. I've observed this actually happened. One of my daughters at a middle school here in Ann Arbor was given this game to play as a reward after she finished all of her worksheets in the test early, right? So that totally undermines the point of the game because then it's not about building confidence. It's just like it's candy at the it's a candy prize for having done your math fast. So there are lots of things you could still do with this kind of technology that would undermine what the designers wanted to do. I would argue there are probably many things you could do as a teacher that would amplify its power, right? So this is not just about bad teachers screw up technology all the time. It's sometimes teachers make technology even better. And so we wanted to study all these variations and try to understand which ones led to better learning outcomes for students in the end. We didn't get to do that. Maybe one of you will. So Lure of the Labyrinth. Let's look at some other games like this. So now we're going to take a little break, and we'll turn the camera off to let people do this at home on their own for a little while. Or I don't know what we're going to do, since if it's live streaming, we'll play the Jeopardy music or something. So I want you to go to a website called BrainPop. It's a new site called GameUp. So brainpop.com/games. Oh, questions? Not really. All right, well, no questions here yet. Feel free if you wish. So, but let me go to BrainPop and just show you what this looks like. Oops. Darn my autocomplete. There we go. So it's organized by content area. science, math, social studies, health. I recommend doing this in pairs if you can, right? So one person can look and one person can comment and take turns. We'll spend, let's see, what time is it now? It's 10:15. You know, we'll do this for, I want you to really get into the game, so we'll spend at least half an hour, and we'll incorporate our break in that half an hour, okay? So we can look at a lot of games and take a break. During the meantime, there's a single restroom here, but if you need to go back downstairs, there's more. There's a coffee shop. I know we said we'd have coffee here, but apparently that didn't happen, sorry. There's a coffee shop in the front of the dining hall downstairs too, Java Blue. And pick a game that you like and examine it. So, you know, jump into social studies and you can pick something that you want to examine. Quandary is a particularly good one. It's another Scott Osterweil designed game, Scott Osterweil et al. There's a big team at MIT in a group called the Education Arcade. BrainPop is this great company in New York that is aggregating these games and delivering, they're all delivered by Flash. So the bad side is you can't do them on tablets like the iPad. The good side is that it removes all the need for schools to install and manage licenses for games, because one of the big bugaboos for education technology is getting it installed and running properly. And games have the worst security stuff on them. It's so terrible, and often actually can make other parts of your computer not work well, that people are really averse to installing them. Educational games, not so much, but it can happen. So BrainPop has sort of removed all, if you can run a web browser in your school, you can play any of these games. And they're building other tools around it, which I invite you to explore. So curriculum guides, quizzes that you could choose to use around the game, ways for kids to take snapshots of their play sometimes and share them. And I'll talk about a study I'm actually conducting with BrainPop later. But just pick some games and mess around and see, and think about how this game relates to the principles. And next, we're going to talk about motivation theory and some assessment ideas. And I'll invite you to keep thinking as we're going later in the lecture about how these games work. And what we're going to do is after we've talked about motivation and about assessment, then we're going to talk about your experience with these games. So make some specific notes to yourself about what you like about the game, what you don't like about the game, from a learning perspective, right? From a learning and teaching perspective. Not, you know, I thought the characters were stupid. That may or may not be true, but don't focus on that. I always remember, I showed Labyrinth to a class of undergrads, and we actually played through that cafeteria game as a group, and then I asked the class, what did you think? And the very first person who raised their hand said, I don't like it. And I said, why don't you like it? And the answer was, because I only like first-person shooter games. It's like, okay, that's a valid reason not to like a game, but it's not a valid critique of a game, okay? So I'm asking for you to think about this as a critic now, a critic of learning and design. All right, so we'll spend, as I said, till about quarter of on this. So if you happen to be watching the live stream, play around with these games until quarter of, and then we'll come back and we'll continue by talking about motivation. come back together. I hope you all had some fun exploring some of those games. Keep them in mind, right? We're going to, as we now talk about motivation, keep in mind the game and be processing some of what we're talking about now through the experience you just had of that game. And then we'll talk a little bit about assessment design, and again, be thinking sort of through the experience of that game. So now we're going to talk about the motivation theories a little bit explicitly. We didn't read about motivation, but this is a very key topic, I think, especially when we're talking about game design and about all learning. So this will actually be some source material that we'll keep coming back to throughout the rest of the term and thinking about, I hope. Here's a quiz question for you. By a show of hands, how many people think that squirrel is really motivated? Anybody? Adam? Sarah? Just you two. Okay. This squirrel's actually spotted on my back porch a few summers ago. It's about 95 degrees out this day in August. We'll come back to whether the squirrel is in fact motivated or not. All right. Yes, that's called suspense. I'm building suspense. David Perkins recently retired from the Harvard Grad School of Education and a really great learning theory guy. We're going to talk more about his work in the near future. He's got this idea that he calls pretty good pedagogy. And we've talked a bit about advanced pedagogy here. We talked about constructivism and project-based learning, and we talked about different ways to organize instruction. And all of that's well and good. David says, if you don't have this as the basis of what you're talking about, you got nothing. And the basis is clear information, some kind of thoughtful or planful instructional practice, some kind of feedback, right, assessment of some kind, and intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. That those are the 4 pillars of any pedagogy. And without those, I don't care how advanced your learning theory is, it's not going to fly as an instructional environment. So I think this is a good thing to keep in mind, and it's important to recognize that motivation is one of these 4 things. So what is motivation? Well, if you've only heard it talked about sort of in the colloquial, it's in general the study of why people think and behave in certain ways. Not necessarily their thinking itself, like not cognition, it's not about learning, but it's about the conditions that enable achievement and that enable learning. It's what gets us to start doing something, to persist and keep doing it, to see it through to completion. And it's about the sort of the surround, right? So the idea being that if you don't start doing something, if you don't stick with it for some amount of time, and you don't finish it, you probably won't learn the thing that you were intended to learn. So that's what motivation is in a nutshell. It's about attention. It's about how we feel about things, or affect. And it's about effort, or how hard we try. So it's a field of study in psychology that looks across all of those areas related to what are in the aggregate called volitional strategies, right? What gets us up and going. So here's the squirrel in a nutshell. Sorry. Some learners seem to be unmotivated. That's what people say, right? That's the fiction. The fact of it is that learners are always motivated, just not to do the things you want them to do, right? So the challenge in motivational design is convincing people to do the thing that we want them to do. And there's lots of ways to do that, lots of ways. We'll talk about some of those ways today. The squirrel, it turns out, was very motivated to be cool. So what the squirrel was doing was trying to get as wide as possible, get some airflow around him, because as I mentioned, it was a 95-degree day. So the squirrel was very motivated. That was fine. I didn't have anything else I wanted the squirrel to do. But in a classroom, if the motivation is to try to get some sleep, for instance, right, because it's 9 in the morning, you're tired, well, that motivation works against my motivation to get you to engage with something, right? So we have a different challenge there. Okay. Another great philosopher, Calvin and Hobbes. They're both great philosophers. Calvin's got it right. Mom wants me to make my bed. Come help. You get pencils, I'll get some paper. I thought we were making the bed. What they're going to do is invent a robot to make the bed for them. And Calvin's got it great. It's only work if somebody makes you do it. Right? So that's a motivational story there. Right? Even though what Calvin's planning to do is way harder than just making the bed, he's motivated to do this other thing that will result, hopefully, in making the bed. We both know won't. But anyway, that's the idea behind motivation. And between extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation, where making the bed is an external goal. It's about trying to reward somebody for doing something. It's behavioral. It's a very sort of Skinnerian notion, this notion of extrinsic punishment, reward, and so forth. Intrinsic is what's internal to the person. It's more about cognitive views of mental state, affect, and so forth. It's about your personal goal. So for Calvin, that robot is a personal goal. That's the intrinsic motivation that will lead him to do the thing that other people want to get him to do. As we said earlier, this is not necessarily all bad. This is not necessarily all good. These things happen in combination to lead people to get people engaged in tasks that they may not have thought of doing to begin with. So just in a nutshell, we have motivation towards goals, so you can have positive motivation. We have motivation away from goals, really playing around with all my animations. We have intrinsic on the right and extrinsic on the left. And instructionally, we're trying to get people to want to write a paper, right? So what's the 20% project all about? Well, part of what I'm trying to do is get you to, I don't care if you write papers or not, that's up to you. But I'm trying to get you to produce a thing because you want to produce it. And that, I predict, will be more interesting for me to read than something that I assigned and scripted and said it has to meet these criteria. That's going to be less interesting for me because I'm going to see the same thing over and over again in different shades. What we were trying to do is sorry, you know what, we're not going to go back and reanimate that. Well, yes, I will because I have to now. So we're trying to get learners to do challenging things, and we're trying to get them to do it on their own. Not because of a grade, that's extrinsic, not because of failure or fear of failure. And this is still intrinsic. They don't want to do it, but it's negative. We don't want it to be a way. So we're always trying to induce sort of positive motivation toward a goal and thinking of the ways to get it done. The grade could certainly be what gets you started. But in the end, it's going to be a much better paper for you to write and for the instructor to read if you end up wanting to write it, right? If it's on a topic that interests you sufficiently and you're enjoying the process of exploring it. Carol Dweck is a very famous psychologist. She's currently at Stanford. And she came up with this idea that she calls mindset. And many of you may have heard of this because it's actually become quite popular recently. And there's some programs you could actually purchase to help change learners' mindsets, like to help your children develop a positive mindset. And the two kinds of mindsets, and there are more, but the two main ones that Dweck talks about are fixed mindset and growth mindset. This is actually really related, for those of you in education who heard Claude Steele speak and read Claude Steele's book, very much related to the whole stereotype threat idea also. But a fixed mindset learner believes that you're just born smart or not. And if you can't do something, it must be because you're just not, it's not for you. You're not smart enough to do that. You're not capable of doing it. You're not strong enough, fast enough, agile enough, whatever, to do that thing. A growth mindset learner, on the other hand, believes that everything is learnable, including intelligence. You tend to stick with a problem when you see it, and you're incremental, right? You say, well, if I keep at it long enough, if I practice enough, if I try to break the task down, then I'll get better. It turns out that there's some really interesting fallout from these two ways of thinking. And very, very smart kids, the way school is designed today, actually end up falling into the fixed mindset approach very frequently. Because if you, for instance, always, like if school is super easy for you and you don't have to ever work very hard at it, that happens to a lot of kids in elementary school. Suddenly, stuff starts to get hard in middle school and high school, like the math gets real. And you can't do it. Well, you could say, you know what, I'm going to figure this out. Or you could say, but it was always so easy for me. So if I can't do it, it must just mean I can't do it. So that's life, I guess, right? I've hit my limit in math. And learned helplessness is a phrase that we use to talk about this problem sometimes, where people learn how to not persist, right? Because they never had to before, so why should they have to in the future? A lot of this comes down to this notion of responsibility. So it's where you put the blame for your ability to accomplish something or not. So you might have an internal locus of control or an external locus of control, and you may think that something can be controlled or can't be controlled. This is the worst category, right? If you think that the locus of control is outside of you and it can't be helped, That just leaves it up to luck or chance, right? So that's like a lottery. Well, whatever, you know, I mean, I couldn't do anything about it. So if you don't do well on a test, and your reason for that, you say, well, I studied pretty hard, but the teacher asked questions I didn't study for. Bad luck. Oh, well. Maybe it's something that you can control, or that it's internal to you, but you still don't feel like you have any control about it. So maybe it's a test of physical, you know, in gym class. Well, you know, we were supposed to do 5 pull-ups, but I just couldn't. I'm just not strong enough. So I don't do well in gym. I'm just not an athlete, so I'm just not gonna pass that test. Or it could be in any subject, right? Where, well, that's just, no, writing isn't my thing, so I couldn't have done well in that test. You might blame task difficulty. Well, you know, I studied, but I guess I didn't study the right problems again. That's sort of you might have some control over that, but it again is something that was out of your control. What we're really shooting for, of course, is this, right? When someone believes that something is within their control, they work harder, that leads to effort production, and then they tend to get better at it. To the stereotype threat idea, there's lots of research showing that if you prime people in different ways, they actually can overcome the mindset problem. So for instance, if you give a bunch of learners a test and you say to them beforehand, this is a really hard test and people don't do well in this test, but just do whatever you can. And you take another comparable group of learners and you say, you know, this test is challenging, but it's been shown that people who really take their time and think hard about the problems do much better than people who don't. The second group will always outperform the first group, right? Just by suggestion. There's no other difference between those two groups of learners. And there's some interesting side effects to this that occur sort of in culture all the time. So for instance, when Barack Obama was elected president the first time, there was a brief spike in standardized test scores of African American students in America. Why? How could we possibly explain this? Well, the answer is sort of an image of, oh, look, somebody kind of like me became president. Maybe it's possible that I could do well. It was temporary. These effects tend to be temporary. But that is a case of this mindset sort of idea in practice. And it's really fascinating. And if you read Claude Steele's book, or if you heard Claude Steele speak, a really sad thing is you would start to realize that all testing is sort of is subject to this, right? So feelings that, well, girls aren't good at math, or African Americans aren't as logical as other African Americans, or Asian students are just always going to do better than I am. So in a comparison set, right, in math and science, if you tell Caucasian learners that this is sort of a test of their performance, they do far better than if you tell Caucasian learners that they're being compared to Asian American learners. Just because it activates in somebody's head the idea that, oh, well, I'm not supposed to be as good as this other group, so therefore I'm not. And these are fascinating and very persistent effects that we can think about motivational designs to overcome. Questions about that, by the way, before we move on? It's interesting to think about that in relation to yourself, right, and what you face. And it's also interesting to note that a major activator, at least in my observation, of the fixed mindset is when things are too easy for too long, right? So we go back to that game design principle, freedom to fail, right? If you don't have the freedom to fail, then you tend to pick pathways in which you won't fail, and therefore you never learn that you can actually do hard things, because you're constantly trying to avoid hard things because the cost of failure is too high. Another major and very useful set of theories is what are called goal theories. So this actually comes out of researchers here at Michigan, Paul Pintrich, many others, Carol Midgley, in our combined program in education and psychology have studied for years and years and years now this idea of what goals you might have as a learner. And you start to see how these things relate to each other and speak to each other. But for instance, if you are a mastery-oriented learner, that's very good. Your goal is to understand and develop competence. And in study after study, learners who exhibit these mastery orientations simply do better than learners with this other kind of motivation, which is a performance motivation. So if you're performance-oriented, you might be either performance approach or performance avoidant. In the first, you are seeking to demonstrate adequate performance. So that's your goal. I want to show people that I'm good enough. Or you could want to pick a path that avoids showing people that you're not good enough. In both cases, you can think of what the negative effects are. In the first one, you will avoid challenging tasks so that you look like you're a winner. In the second one, the same thing, except now you're trying to avoid looking like a loser. So these things are very highly related and lead to avoiding challenges. And we've used this in our own research on gameful class design and found over and over and over again that all the learners at Michigan exhibit one or the other of these tendencies. But also by using a more gameful or playful course design, like the one we're using in this class, we can overcome this, that it doesn't matter what your approach is, that in a gameful class where there's some freedom to fail or freedom to explore, learners will take on more challenging tasks even if their performance approach or performance avoid in general. And we do this by, there's some survey instruments that we use to find out what their motivation orientation is, and then we compare that to the number and kinds of tasks people take on. Now back to self-determination theory. This to me is as much a motivation theory as it is a design theory. But these are the components that I had in my principles, right? So there's autonomy, belonging, and competence. Autonomy, that you have choices to make and they're consequential choices. Belonging, that you're part of something bigger than yourself. Competence, a sense of efficacy, that you're always challenged at the right level. It's not too hard for too long and it's not too easy for too long. The first one leads to frustration, the second leads to boredom. What is interesting, and there's a lot of different, there's a whole sort of almost a cult of research around this now. It's really interesting. A cottage industry might be a better way to describe it, but I really like these theories. And Ryan and DC are the two main movers behind this theory. I think they're at University of Rochester. Could be wrong, but I think that. In study after study after study, they found that when you have these three components together, ABC is a good easy way to remember them, that you tend to find more positive intrinsic motivation in the people who are engaged in the environment. And when these elements are present in a negative way or not present, you find more extrinsic motivation being fostered. Okay, what's the point of that? Now, I'd said earlier we would touch on violence in video games, and this is the point where we're going to do that. Lots of people have tried to look at whether or not violent video games, classified as you would imagine, lead to feelings of aggression or violence, or even worse, violent action in the people who play them. And if you read the meta-reviews of the literature in this area or any of the studies, the reporting is fairly bad. But if you read the research, you find that there is, in fact, some evidence for increased feelings of aggression or arousal, is how the researchers talk about it, among people who play very violent video games. But the effect seems to be pretty short-lived, and doesn't ever seem to, there's no evidence that it translates to negative action in the world. So that seems to be, Jim G actually has this great argument he makes where he says, if it was true that violent video games led directly to violent action, then every time E3, the big entertainment expo in Los Angeles was held, there would be mayhem in the streets. And it's just not true. And every time there's a violent sort of incident in America, one of the first narratives the media goes to is back to video games and how, well, you know, that kid played a lot of video games and was sort of a loner with video games. So first of all, sometimes they're just wrong. So in the Virginia Tech shooting incident, they reported that the person who was the shooter played a lot of video games and was sort of a loner because of that. And it turns out that the person didn't play video games. Their housemates were always trying to get them to play video games with them, and he never would. So he was a loner, it's true, but he was not a loner who played video games. He was just a loner. In other cases, people will say, oh, that it was often males are involved in this, these kinds of incidents, and they point out how the person plays a lot of video games. Well, I might also point out that if you find any male in American society between the ages of 10 and 30, they probably play a lot of video games, right? So there's a causation-correlation confound there between the fact that people happen to play video games, they often happen to be violent, and they lead to violent activity. What's really going on is more that we're dealing with people who have serious mental problems. And that's what's behind this. And is the video game a trigger for their behavior? That part of the research is very unclear. But certainly society as a whole is not very well organized to help these kinds of folks. But let me get back to this. There's some people who have studied violence in video games as related to aggression with this as a lens, with these three ideas of whether autonomy, a sense of consequential choice, a sense of being a part of something, and support for competence are present in negative or positive ways. And I forget what games they study, but they picked some popular games and they sort of studied them for whether they did this. So a game that gives you consequential choice, you can imagine, so you choose one path or another and it matters. One is harder or easier or more interesting or less interesting personally. Belonging. Anyone seen this game called Left 4 Dead? Anyone play Left 4 Dead? Left 4 Dead is a fantastic game where you're sort of battling zombies. But it's got this really intriguing feature, which is that the 4 isn't just F-O-R, it's a number 4. You've got to play it with 3 other people. And all 4 of you have to play together. And you have to be sort of coordinated in order to survive. So it's really a cooperation game. More than anything, because if you don't learn how to work with these other 3 players, you're not going to get very far. And that's what makes that game interesting, not shooting zombies, but figuring out how to coordinate a team and lead the team successfully through. And it's sort of self-organizing. There's not one person who's in charge. So that can be really fast. And you've got to help each other. If one of you gets eaten or killed or whatever, you can be healed, but someone's got to come back and put themselves at risk to help you out. But it's a collective action problem, right? If you do that, you can keep getting further through the game, and you have to find ways to protect each other. I really recommend this experience. It's quite fascinating. And support for competence, right? That you're not constantly feeling like you're not good enough. That you feel like what you're doing is leading you in a progressive and positive direction. When these things are present in a game that has a lot of violent depiction, it turns out that people do not have the same feelings of aggression at the end as when these things are present in a negative way or not present. So it may be not the violence in the game that matters, but actually the way the game is constructed that matters, right? The way the motivational design of the game works. And that's a really powerful idea. So I want to make sure I'm communicating it clearly. You can actually have exactly the same violent imagery in an experience, but if the person feels support for their choice making, they feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves, and they feel supported in terms of their abilities in the game, it does not seem to lead to greater feelings of violence or aggression or arousal or any of that. And when those things are negatively represented in the game design, it does. So that's sort of intriguing, right? It's something to think about when you're trying to say whether a game may lead to people feeling more aggression or not. I think we need more research in this area, but the same things could also be true for whether it leads to productive feelings of learning, right? Whether you feel intrinsic motivation, whether you feel like you're working towards something is important. And it suggests something to me about the way school should be designed, right? So if these things are true, then you want to think about these 3 things. So Jim G. has been writing and speaking a lot recently on what he sees as the problem with hyper-individualizing instruction. So there's a school in New York as a sort of a charter experiment called the School of One. And what the School of One is a very personalized curriculum where you spend a lot of your time interacting with computer-based tutors and other programs. You're sort of with other people in the space, but it's really you and the computer. And to G, this is a real problem because what it's doing is decreasing feelings of belonging, right? You're not in it with other students anymore. Even it may not lead to predictive learning outcomes, but for instance, at the lab I worked as a graduate student, there was a sort of central, very polarizing figure, this guy who directed the lab, and there were many negative things about the influence of this person on the lab, but sort of an interesting positive thing was it brought the rest of us together in a really productive way. Sort of talk about what that person had done that day, or this crazy thing that they were ruling that we had to do, and so it created sort of inadvertently a sense of belonging. Questions about this? To me, this is the most important. If you take one idea away from today, take this idea, right? That we're trying to design to encourage these 3 things in any learning environment. So another thing that's important to keep in mind is that different people will feel differently about any design that we have, right? This is tough. So it makes this even more challenging because what makes one person feel competent may not be the same thing that makes another person feel competent. What makes one person feel supported may not make another person feel supported. So this is important, and again, just to illustrate this in practice, or in fictional practice, The Simpsons.
Principal Skinner, remember how I used to when I found that scorpion in my applesauce? Well, I'm calling in a favor.
I knew this day would come.
Attention! All honor students will be rewarded with a trip to an archaeological dig. Conversely, all detention students will be punished with a trip to an archaeological dig.
So you do have to keep that in mind. All right, so we're going to switch to talking about feedback and assessment now. So hopefully you just thinking about the games you played on Game Up in relation to their motivation design. Take a moment now and to think about that too. Like, how does the game get you to want to be involved, right? What are the initial extrinsic designs in the game that say, here's why you want to do this? How does it switch over to intrinsic? How does it support competence? Do you have a sense of belonging when you're playing it? And by the way, belonging in a game doesn't have to be in a game. It could be in the surround of the game. So when you play Grand Theft Auto, that may be an experience that you could have mostly you versus you and the computer alone, but you're part of a larger culture playing Grand Theft Auto. And so that's what you might talk about around the water cooler or whatever. So learning experiences that feel isolating when you're in them, if you know that lots of people are doing, this is, by the way, one of the big challenges people are facing now with time-shifting television, right? It used to be that you knew everybody watched that show last night, and so you could go talk about it the next day. Now, if you time shift, it's a little bit less clear. And people, actually the whole reason, there was an interesting On the Media piece on this, actually on Saturday, if you happen to listen to On the Media, about the laugh track. So the laugh track was in part invented because we benefit a lot from hearing how other people are reacting to something, and that helps us figure out how we're supposed to feel about the experience. And if you want to watch something interesting, on YouTube somewhere is a bunch of clips of the sitcom Friends with the laugh track removed. And it's very weird. It's like the jokes just aren't funny. They keep things that are funny fall flat. Zach?
Well, on the flip side of that, I've seen some clips on YouTube where they take parts of horror movies and put laugh tracks over what happens.
Exactly the same idea,
And
right.
You get a lot of parts where you realize this actually is much funnier than I should think it is.
Mm-hmm. Same thing. It's this sort of notion that you're taking your cues from the people around you, even people that you know are fake. Right? The laugh track cues you. Now they're talking about how Twitter might do that for us. So if you're watching a single camera show without a laugh track, you sort of look at the Twitter feed and you get a sense of what other people are saying, and that helps you shape your experience to that. Right? Like, should I be horrified by Miley Cyrus or not? Oh, yes, horrified. I'm horrified. Another thing that is, like Twitter right now is trying to figure out technologically, is there a way to time shift tweets about a show, right? So if you watch a show in real time, there's a live tweeting of it. They're trying to figure out technologically, can we time shift that? So if you watch a show later, you can call up sort of a replay of all the live tweets, and that is sort of like the laugh track, right? It's a really intriguing idea, because I personally find it, I'm not saying, I don't know whether this is a good thing or a bad thing about me, but if I think a thing and then I see online that lots of other people think it too, I feel kind of better about the thing I think. I'm like, oh yeah, that's like validation for me. So there's something to this.
And our whole political system.
Lots of things work that way, right? It's not by accident that the world is operating the way it is right now. Some people are getting too much direct validation of views without enough invalidation of broader communities, but that's a whole different class. Whole different program, actually, department. All right, so let's transition talking about assessment, because that's the third pillar. Remember, we talked about learning theory, sort of talked about instructional goals, we talked about motivation, and now this idea of feedback, because Perkins pointed it out, it's true of all learning environments, feedback of some kind is essential. So you always want to know how you're doing. And in a game, right, you might ask, what's the score? The score is often the notion of how you're doing. And it's got to be frequent, and it's got to be informative. And there are two kinds that we talk about in education. We talk about formative assessment and summative assessment. And very simply, summative assessment is what comes at the end. So it's the final exam. There's typically not a lot of things you can do as a learner after a summative assessment. You can take that with you to the next class or sit down and try to figure out what you did wrong, but in general, summative means assessment of outcome. Formative assessment is meant to inform, right? So it's about guiding your future learning. So a well-designed formative assessment task is one where I can see how you're doing and I can give you feedback, and that feedback should be corrective to help you improve on what you're doing. And this works in all different domains of life. But there can be some interesting side effects. So I recently, well, first, this is a quote from Black and William. They did a meta review of formative assessment practices. And they found that when student achievement is determined, figured out, and then used by teachers, it's one of the most powerful learning interventions, right? When it's done properly. It has a greater effect on outcome than anything else you can do, because it's about knowing where the learner is and then making a mid-course correction to help the learner accomplish as much as they can within their current abilities. So this turns out to be extremely powerful. Now I came across this guy Torrance. I don't know where Torrance is, but there's this really interesting article that looked at different kinds of formative assessment and came up with a kind of a cool way to think about them, which I think also works very well in the game world. There can be conformative assessments. This is formative assessment that's meant to get you to toe the line, to sort of stay on track. It doesn't necessarily need to be negative, but you need to conform with the lesson plan. There can be deformative assessments. So these are things that inadvertently, this one is negative by intent, inadvertently you can shut someone down, right, and give them feedback in a way that makes them think they'll never be able to do it. I always think about one Judaic studies professor at my undergraduate institution used to write comments on a paper like, "Is English your first language?" when he clearly knew it was. You know, not helpful feedback. Transformative assessment is unexpected and rare, but really valuable. It's when the kind of feedback you get helps you actually move above and beyond even the original goals of the task. Right? It makes you realize what you're actually capable of in a very powerful way, and it generates new forms. Sometimes these are actually from the, you can think of this from the learner's perspective or from the teacher's perspective, right? That if you give a teacher a bunch of tasks and are trying to support their use of assessment, that a conformative assessment tasks helps the teacher, helps the whole system stay in line with the standards. Deformative assessment may make it harder for the teacher to help meet the standards. It actually makes them think they can't accomplish the teaching either. And transformative might help the teacher just make the classroom into something beyond what even the original designers of that activity imagined it might be. So I like to keep these three things in mind because there's, again, a lot of things you can do to give a player or a learner feedback. And you want to ask yourself, what am I doing here, right? Am I enabling people to achieve what I want? Am I hopefully enabling them to go beyond what I want? Or am I actually shutting them down with the feedback I'm giving them? So that's very important. And by the way, even a very bad assessment design can shut people down without even giving any feedback at all, right? So if your feedback is sporadic or never happens, so if you, for instance, don't get feedback for a very, very long time, or if you get sort of random feedback, we talked about this a little bit when we talked about learning theory and behaviorism. If I give random reinforcement, it leads to superstitious behavior. So people start trying to invent ways. Remember, we saw that video from Better Off Ted with the red lab coat. You know, just sort of weird random feedback that doesn't appear very well attached to what's going on can lead you to maybe be very motivated in a weird direction, but in a way that's not really grounded in what we're trying to accomplish. So what can we do in games? And again, we can think about what we might be able to do in the real world. So we could just think about the games you just played, because they have all manner of formative assessment properties built into them, and we'll come back to some of these. I don't think any of you played long enough to sort of see what some of these were, but maybe you got a hint. So first, if I'm a teacher or someone who's interested in your learning progress, I could just look over your shoulder, right? I could try to observe what you're doing with the games. Find out what your score is, find out where you are in the game. If I'm a helpful designer thinking about a teacher trying to manage a classroom full of people, like the Labyrinth designers might use a leaderboard type of approach. This leaderboard doesn't have to be, well, a leaderboard, actually there's really 3 possible positions on a leaderboard, right? There's you, there's everybody above you who you hate, and there's everybody below you who hates you. So I personally find leaderboards probably not the best approach to go, but probably not the best approach in the classroom. We'll talk about those in a moment, actually. I actually have an example of that for you. But they do show relative progress. So that's why in Gradecraft, and I'm going to show Gradecraft in some detail in a moment, explain it to you a little more, and also sort of explain it for the people who may be watching this, since they don't know what Gradecraft is or how we're using it. But it's meant to be relative progress, and in Gradecraft we're using these box and whisker plots as a way to show you relative progress without the sort of deformative aspects of a leaderboard. A dashboard is better, right? So a thoughtful game designer, I misspoke before about this, a thoughtful game designer might give the teacher the ability to track individual progress without having to look over everybody's shoulder. So if you think about sort of a display for a teacher that uses data analytics that would show sort of how well each learner is meeting all the intended learning goals that are present in the game. That's very useful. You know, I might want a report that I can look at once a week and see where everybody is and figure out how to help them get further. And finally, badges. Badges are in the air now. A lot of people are talking about badges. We actually have a week coming up on this toward the end of the semester where we're going to get more into this and read more about it. But I just wanted to give, because it's so connected to the game idea, I thought we would talk a little bit about it today, just sort of to whet your appetite about it. But badges are game-inspired feedback, right? So badges are a way to give rewards to people that might be extrinsic, might be intrinsic, and we should think about which ones they are. So first of all, in school, so first, everyone knows what I mean when I say badges, right? Do you? Raise your hand if you're not sure. It comes sort of, the most popular form of these in the past generation was sort of Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts would get badges that denoted that you had accomplished certain things. Like you knew how to build a campfire, you get the campfire badge. You knew how to do first aid, you get a first aid badge. And that was a way to denote competency in different concrete domains that would communicate something to other people. If you were wearing the badge, they could sort of see it and say, oh, you know how to tie knots. I'm gonna invite you to show me how to tie knots, perhaps. I'm not sure how often it played out that way, but that was sort of the idea of the badge system. So it turns out we've had a long-standing badge system in school. We call them grades. And actually, I had an English teacher who had a whole big speech when I was in 10th grade about how, when we got our first paperback, she said, well, some of you got A's and some of you got B's, but does it mean that you're literally an A or you're literally a B? And she had this whole thing about how you're not your grade. It's because we viewed the grades like badges, like the scarlet letter, right? I'm a big C here. It's a terrible badge system is the problem. So this is a recurring theme in this class, especially related to games. All school is a game. It's just a bad game. And I'll give you an explicit breakdown of that metaphor later. But the lousy badge system that we have emphasizes the extrinsic motivation. That's why my teacher had to tell us that we weren't our grade. There's too few goals attached to it, and the bandwidth of communication about the learning is also very thin too. So for instance, say I'm teaching a 200 level physics class. In theory, everyone in my class has taken a 100 level physics class. But Chris, you got to be in that class. And Murat, you also got to be in that class. Can I assume that you both know the same thing? No. You might have each gotten a different 15% of that class wrong, right? And so I don't really know based on the grade you have, which is all the information I might have. If I'm lucky, I may not know anything about you as a new student in my class. I may not know enough to really make any judgment about where I should begin, right? So that's a problem. Badges are meant to unpack that problem a little bit. So, and transcripts, by the way, I'll argue are really about branding, right? So in the end, what you want to have is a Michigan transcript. That's better than, an Ohio State transcript. That's the idea. That's why you chose one school over another, is in part because of the brand that school has associated with it. That's why we make such a big deal when we go up in the rankings, and we ignore it when we go down in the rankings. All right, so what is new here? What are we talking about? Well, first of all, if we're simply talking about changing the grades into badges, that's not sufficient, right? That's just a relabeling. That's gamification. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But what we really want to do is use the badge as a way to give feedback such that it opens a conversation for what people know how to do and what the possibility space is. So the current crop of badge thinking, and actually we have a guy named Dan Hickey who's going to come give a talk in the seminar on learning analytics right before Thanksgiving. And Dan is one of the sort of leading world experts in badges and thinking about badges and learning. So I'll remind you that when it comes up. But it's a great Friday talk series where he'll talk about his research on badges. But what they're finding is that badges can really improve motivational design when you use them to emphasize mastery, right? And so for instance, that's what the Boy Scout and Girl Scout badges are, that you've mastered a topic. So when you show enough that you can do it, you get a badge. They encourage progress. So in the Boy Scout world, the progress is like toward ever higher levels of scouting. But it could also be that you could have sub-skill badges, right? So a badge could actually have a progression. So a lot of the early badge work online has been done in sort of programming environments. So I forget some of the name of these, but there's a bunch of learn how to program sites that use badges. And there's sub-skills towards becoming expert in different areas that you can earn badges towards, or partial badges. Khan Academy uses badges in this way too, showing that you have mastered some parts of a topic but not all of it. What's the purpose of that? Well, one purpose is that as an instructor now I can look at your badges and I can tell exactly what different parts of Physics 100 you knew because your badges will demonstrate that to me, right? So it can reveal interesting knowledge. In a lot of these learning how to program websites, can anyone think of a name? I just can't right now. Code Academy, that's one of the core ones, yes. So what it also shows is who has knowledge that you might call upon to help you if you're stuck on something. Right, so a badge display, you can choose what badges to display, can be a way to demonstrate that you have knowledge that you're willing to share with others, and that knowledge is verified in some way by whoever issued the badge. So that's also important. That's where the Michigan brand is important on your transcript. For better or worse, an employer or a graduate school or somebody who's looking at your Michigan transcript will take the fact that it came from Michigan as somehow evidence that what is on this transcript has value, right? They're attributing that value. I don't know whether that's, is that good? I don't know, right? Is it more valuable than, something that came from, Joe's Technical Institute? Maybe. Again, that's something we have learned to assume as a matter of branding. And badges, especially digital badges, a really interesting feature of them, and we'll look at this a lot more at the end of the semester, is that you can dig into the actual work behind the badge, ideally, right? That I can see who issued the badge, I can see what the badge was issued for. If there's a digital artifact, I might be able to call up the original artifact if I care to, right? The idea is that it's a lot harder to bury the rationale behind why you accomplished a thing. Ellen's doing a lot of work with badges too, so I'm going to pull you into this conversation later around the current work. So all these are positive. You can also, by the way, put an expiration date on a badge, right? So, you were trained in a particular cardiac repair technique as a surgeon. You have a badge for that. I'm not sure the badge is what I would look for primarily, although doctors engage deeply in badging activities. I can't think of a single other profession where people hang diplomas on the wall the way doctors do, right? In such numbers. It's a really intriguing thing about what they're doing is badging, right? Look, here's my Michigan Medical School badge. I've accomplished that. And that's supposed to mean something to you as a patient, that you'll trust that label. But that cardiac repair proficiency needs to be renewed every so many years. So you need to renew your badge. That's actually how medicine works. People have to keep renewing their certifications for certain kinds of medical practice. And the badge, if you do these things right, it can support those elements of self-determination that we talked about before. Right? Because it can enable more autonomy. You have choice what skills you want to pursue now. Ideally, you might lay out a whole sort of universe of different possible sub-skills to pursue and then let the learner loose to pursue them as they want. So gamification is the word that often gets associated with these things, right? Is this just gamification? Because when people think about using badges or using games in learning, they think about sort of relabeling what's going on, and that is weak design. That's why I think if we just use badges as a substitute for grades, we're really in trouble. So here's an example of what this might look like. This comes from a show that some of you may recognize, Malcolm in the Middle.
Well, I have your test results. You all got A's. But since this is the gifted class, I also factored in cogency of argument, economy of language, and penmanship, which enabled me to do this.
What is that?
A ranking board.
But I thought you said we all got A's.
Oh, you did. But some of you got better A's than others.
But we all still have A's?
Of course.
So, what does being number one get you?
Nothing. Just the knowledge that you are number one, or that you are not number one. Yes, number 5.
It's Dabney, sir.
I know. What is it, number 5?
I forgot.
So, okay. That's why I don't like leaderboards. By the way, another class that's using Gradecraft does have a leaderboard. And one of the things we'll be asking is, in the research design is that, what's the effect of the leaderboard? So we're curious about that. But Ian Bogost, Georgia Tech, great tech writer, studier of games, maker of games. He gets it right when he says gamification is bullshit. And he's actually quoting a famous philosopher from Princeton named Harry Frankfurt, who wrote a great treatise called On Bullshit, which talked about what it really is, which is a tool that one uses to conceal your real aims, to impress people in some way, or to coerce people, right? That's why we use bullshit in rhetoric. And we use it in gamification to get maybe someone to always fly your airline, right? To conceal the fact that our prices are not the greatest because you want those points to get the status. You'll always fly our airline. That's a coercive move also. And in the leaderboard example, you could definitely see how it was coercive, right? And you could see how it was meant to conceal the instructor's true aim, which if you watch the rest of that episode of Malcolm in the Middle, becomes to get the kids to really work hard because they want to be number one. And so there's a later discussion in the show where they're talking about Moby Dick, and as the student is speaking, the teacher is moving their thing up or down the board based on the intelligence of what they're saying. And this gets the kid to keep going as long as they can. It's quite worth watching. Anyway, we want to avoid gamification at all costs. That's why you hear me using this tortured phrase, gamefulness or playfulness or game-inspired, because I really want to avoid the common mass market use of this term gamification. All right, so now let's talk about the games you guys saw. So we want to think about their motivation design. We want to think about their learning design and their assessment design. So I notice a lot of you looking at Quandary. How many of you look at Quandary? A lot. So it's because I said it came from Scott Osterweil probably. So how do you what's the engagement design there, the motivational design? How do they get someone to want to play Quandary? How do they get you to want to play Quandary? I mean, I said go look at Quandary, but then you looked at it and something made you want to click to the next screen. What did they do? Narrative. Yeah, what's the narrative? There's some big societal problem. Help me solve it. They sort of appeal to you as a wise person who can help resolve a problem, right? Okay, oh, you have a problem? I'll listen to your problem. So it's a kind of narrative device. Who played another game? Who played the Sports Network too? Pat, you played that, right? What was the motivation device in there?
That you'll be, you're related to basically a newscast or a sportscaster.
So it was an identity kind of motivation, right? It's you're going to pretend to be a newscaster. So a lot of kids love ESPN, they love SportsCenter. Oh, I'm going to learn how to be a sportscaster, and I'll interview important sports figures on this sports network. So it's a game that motivates you to get into. It again appeals to narrative, it appeals to identity formation. Both have identity going on. You guys looked at Ice Cream Truck.
Yeah, we were highly extremely motivated because both of us really love ice cream.
So appeal to universals, right? And in that game, you have to manage an ice cream truck, so you have to figure out how do you set a price, How do you order inventory, right? How do you keep cash flow liquid? You know, so it's a very traditional set of math tasks, but all arranged here around a goal where you've got to keep this truck going. So sort of the motivation thing is keep the truck from failing, and you know, because you want to make more people happy with ice cream. How about learning designs? Who played a game with an interesting learning design? Well, let's go back to Quandary. How does Quandary get you to learn? What's the idea?
They put you in a scenario and they want you to engage with it and learn how to do teamwork and cooperation and those things. So you're doing the things they want you to learn just by participating in the narrative.
And they're presenting you with a bunch of choices for this quandary, right? Kind of gets more and more complicated. But they're all sort of reasonable, right? And what they're trying to teach, I think, in a way, is that it's not black and white. You could make an argument in different directions depending on what your goals are and where you're headed. And so what they want you to do, I don't think there's a right outcome in quandary, but you have to learn how to make an argument and stand behind it, and understand sort of what the implications of that direction are. That's kind of an interesting idea. You saw not such a great learning design, Anna, right, in Lord of the Flies. What was that?
It was just a quiz on whether you read the book recently.
So it's a game that's meant to accompany the reading of Lord of the Flies, but sort of like a movie game tie-in, right? It's like, oh, I get to replay the game a little bit now. Now, we'd have to dig in more. Because you guys had a brief look, we're probably being a little unfair to some of these games. A lot of them, by the way, did anyone play like Tree Frog Treasure or anyone look at a game that had a very elaborate storyline behind it that seemed not so related to what you were trying to learn? It's actually one of my complaints about a lot of these games, which is that the cover story is very elaborate. So like Tree Frog Treasure is a game where you have to jump this tree frog around and you collect jewels along the way. That's the treasure. And you're really learning about fractions. Yeah. You know, first it takes me a little while to learn the mechanics, and secondly it takes me a while to get into the narrative, but it's not really related to fractions. So it's more in the Math Blaster category for me of like, it's kind of connected to what's going on. It's better than Math Blaster, but still has that flaw. Pat?
Went through argument wars,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought it was pretty interesting, but it's just click through as fast as you can for 5 minutes. You don't really interject at all, and then it tells you how to play the game,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have to actually start playing.
Oh, so it gives you some experience first, and then it unpacks that experience.
Right. Well, there's an interaction between you, another lawyer, and the judge.
Uh-huh.
And there's this conversation that you're just clicking through,
Mm-hmm.
kind of setting it up, and then you start to, then it teaches you how to play the game,
Mm-hmm.
and then you start. So it's kind of drawn out at the beginning too.
I mean, one thing I really like about Game Up is that it's a huge collection of games, right? And they're games that BrainPop thinks have value. Whether they do or not depends on how they're used. But it's sort of it's like a zoo for educational games. You know, they're all there in one place. You can go look at them and try to make sense of them. They've got if you scroll down to the bottom of the screen, there are little instructional material guides at various levels that help you understand how to connect the game. Now, what about assessment design? Did anyone see any of these? You probably didn't. You have to go too far into the game, and you really need to look at it as a teacher might. So you could subscribe to BrainPop and then get access to different kinds of dashboards. So Zach, did you see any?
I played the do blocks.
Yeah.
It's called where you're trying to manipulate a block to land in a certain spot correctly. And I did see an assessment that they keep track of how long it takes you.
Mm-hmm.
They give you little gold, silver, bronze medals for each. So I mean there is kind of a really cool,
Right.
You can tell how well you did relative to how well you could do on that level.
And if I were a teacher and I had access to a dashboard of my kids who were playing that game, I might look for what level they were at, how long it took them on a level, if they got to the gold badge level or silver or bronze, right? So that gives me some idea of what the complexity of the problem solving is in that game. I don't know how good a job they do telling me what that means to my math curriculum, but that's not what the game was written probably. So these are the things to think about as you're looking at any game, actually in a question. So whenever I meet with someone from an educational design firm or somebody trying to sell me something in education, the first thing I always ask is, tell me about the learning people on your team. It's remarkable how few teams have learning people. So for instance, a lot of these games actually have their genesis in like a science department, right? Where someone, like Tree Frog Treasure is a math game. It comes out of a math program somewhere, I forget where, like University of Washington, I think, where it was just some mathematicians who thought, oh, we could make a fun education game to teach this math concept. But there weren't really education people involved. And that's where I think games start to get into some trouble. But on the whole, these are meant to be, and I think they are, good examples of games that lead to positive learning. So now let's move on into the third topic and the third and final topic. So improving the game of school, which is really where I think I come down. And a number of you also commented on this in your reading reactions, which is that the point so much isn't necessarily to make all kids, we don't want to replace school with games, right? I don't look at Game Up and think, oh good, I can match each of these games as some part of the curriculum. And then what we'll do in school is instead of me giving out math worksheets, they'll play math games. That, I think, is the wrong way to approach this. Doesn't really change much in the world. I'd really much more like to think about improving the game of school. So let's begin with a metaphor. And credit for this goes to a couple of people. Some of you may know them, but Jeff Kupperman is one. He's a former PhD student here. And Bernie Suits is a philosopher of play, a ludologist, he calls himself. But this is sort of a famous argument about learning from play and learning in what school is like. So you can read along with this in your notes if you want, but in general, this goes back to this notion about the boundary conditions for a game definition. So a voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles where you don't know what the outcome is going to be is a game. But where there's a solution or a best solution, remember how we define that as a puzzle, right? And games have high replay value and puzzles usually don't have replay value. So that's just a review, all right. So when you have a voluntary attempt to overcome a necessary obstacle, we might call that activism or entrepreneurship. You chose to do it. It's a project with a purpose. When there's an involuntary attempt to overcome an unnecessary obstacle, it's either punishment or abuse. You see where this is headed, right? For most students, school feels like punishment because they're not there by choice and the obstacles appear unnecessary. Now, for some students, they're there out of a sense of obligation or duty. That's very extrinsic, right? I'm in school because my family wants me to be in school, or I'm in school so I can go to a good college, or I'm in school so I can get a good job. Sometimes you might view it as a hoop. That's all extrinsic motivation. So when a traditional classroom more or less works, the reason it works is because it's a puzzle. And because puzzles do have their games, right? They have some appeal. You might imagine that the game is trying to guess what the teacher knows. How many of you have played that game? What am I thinking now? Maybe it's trying to figure out what the rules of the institution are, right? So what's going on in this class? Let's try to figure out this. Or figuring out what it means to be a student. So that's why very young learners, so people going to kindergarten for the first time, are very excited about school. They've watched the older kids put on the backpacks and get the lunch boxes and go off to school. They want to do that too. It's an identity thing. They're trying to figure out what this is about. And for a while, the game can actually be very motivating for those students, right? Because it's all new to them. They don't know what's going on, and they're trying to decode what's going on. But because it's a puzzle, its replay value is limited. So the theory here is that as students get older, many of them will tire of the puzzle. It's like, I'm done with that game. I've done that game before. So there's actually a lot of theories in education about, like people talk about the 4th grade slump in literacy. There's a lot of research into why certain students, particularly girls, seem to wash out of math and science classes as you move toward middle school. Why are these things? There's a lot of explanations for this. I actually think the puzzle versus game explanation is a good one, right? That we're simply tired of the design. So we view school as a punishment at a certain point, in which we're compelled to play along to get where we want to go. And if we don't want to go there, then we're not going to play along at all, right? So if your goal is not to get into college, why would you care about the grades you got in school? So that's why it's important for us to make school more playful. And I'm going to move quickly through one example because it's one you're well aware of, which is Gradecraft, right? So trying to change the assessment system. So for me, the reason I made Gradecraft, which is that I think there's a huge amount of informational content in how we evaluate students and how we assign grades and other rewards. Learners have been well trained to respond to the assessment systems. That's part of the puzzle-like game. And so if we start with the assessment system, I think we can get a lot of leverage. So my own work is starting to focus more and more on assessment. Did I show this to you guys in the first class meeting? Okay, well let me walk you through it now because I think it'll make a lot of sense to you. Think about the column on the left as what a traditional classroom assessment system typically is. It rings a bell probably, right? You imagine that there's a midterm and a final. This is sort of college level now, not K-12. There's a midterm and a final. There might be some homework sets. The professor at the beginning of the semester says, you all have 100% today. And it's yours to lose, right? Has anyone actually said that to you? I've heard that a few times. And the whole course is a process then of doing high stakes assignments and losing part of your 100%. So right away, if I take the midterm and I get an 85 on it, now I have an 85. That's my average in the class. And I can look at what I can do on the final. If I get 100% on the final, I'm going to maybe get an A in the class, but I'm never going to get back to 100%, right? So that's a problematic design that we have in the way we do these. And I watch my kids look at PowerSchool, which is sort of an online grade reporting system we use here in Ann Arbor, and many schools use it. And essentially, it's this constant ping-ponging of like what their percent is in the class and trying to think of like what they can do to keep their percent above the mark where they want it to be. So what is that? Well, there's a lack of control. It's often the rationale behind the percentage you have can be vague. And you also, and a lot of this, how many of you have had a class with a participation grade? Right, that's very vague. Who knows what that's going to be? The instructor's picking the focus. The learners sort of get the grades from on high. This creates a disincentive to stretch because of the high stakes of each experience you have and the fact that it incentivizes avoidance. The smart thing to do in that kind of situation is avoid a risky task that may harm your ability to get the grades you want. Whereas in a game-inspired assessment system, we're trying to accomplish the exact opposite. So I don't know whether we've actually accomplished that in this class yet. This is something that we keep tinkering towards. I think graduate classes are a little bit special anyway. But certainly in undergraduate classes, there's a much broader range of motivation for learners in the class typically. And so we're trying to figure out whether these systems, by giving people self-determination, by making the system transparent, by making it a leveling up idea that lowers the cost of failure, gives you multiple pathways to accomplish the goals. We're trying to incentivize progression, right? Congratulations, class, as of today, you all have 0. Now, it's a funny thing to say, so you wouldn't say that necessarily, but at least getting to 100 or whatever your end goal is in your control, is the idea behind these systems. So I can say to everybody, don't worry about what grades you think you want in this class. Get the grade you choose, but you can modify your effort, right? Think of the Carol Dweck graph, right? The internal control versus external control. This system's intent is to put all of the control in your hands so that you can decide what you want your grade to be and then modify your effort to get it. Once you have knowledge that you can control that, my theory is you'll work a lot harder and you'll probably feel better about it too. So that's the thing that we study. You know some of these things because I've said them before, but this is how I do the undergraduate class. A thing I haven't shown you yet is some of this stuff is designed to be a little whimsical too. So in the undergrad class, for instance, there's actually a winner. There's going to be a winner in here too. I'm not planning on doing this for you guys, but somebody's going to get the most points. There may be some ties the way things are laying out here, but in this class there's a winner, and so every year I award the winner sort of, they get a little plaque and their name gets enshrined on this sort of league champions plaque which hangs at the back of the Whitney Auditorium. You can check it out there if you are in that room. And this turns out to be, for some players, this is like super motivating. It's not a leaderboard because I don't tell them who's winning. Just at the end, I tell them which one's won. And Craig in particular, I'm still in touch with. He's very, very proud of this. Brianna actually helped teach the class last year a little bit. She transitioned into graduate school here, and that's actually 2 years ago. The winner, I didn't teach the class last year, but there is a winner. I'm going to be adding her name to the plaque. I'm proud that it's 2 females and 1 male so far. I think that's nice. And I also like the implication, of course, this is the internal higher ed joke, which is that I'm going to be teaching this class for like the next 25 years. Seems unlikely, but we'll see. So I'm going to skip, I'm going to skip over GradeCraft, but I want to point out that this kind of grading system is super hard to do compared to other kinds of grading. So one advantage of the midterm and final and then problem sets and class participation grading system is it's not too much work for the professor. It can be a lot of work, right? So when I got 28 initial conceptual framework papers, trust me, it took me longer to read them than it took any one of you to write them. And that was an easy thing to grade because I was basically just looking to see whether you met the sort of structural requirements. I'm going to spend like 10 days reading your final conceptual frameworks. And that's just one part of it, right? This is why math teachers use bubble sheets. It's like, that's a win for them. But it's a very narrow form of assessment. So if you're going to encourage this kind of game-inspired assessment, you need to give a lot of support to people. And that's why we designed GradeCraft. So, and this is another problem because it's not just hard for instructors. Kathy Davidson is someone, if you follow digital media and learning, you'll come across her name a lot. So she also points out that we have trained students super well to only respond to grades. No Child Left Behind has been one of the most effective behavioral training programs for teachers and for students. I heard some conversation in here at the beginning of class about a student worried, if I do badly on this test, is it going to hurt you? Like, are you going to lose your job? You talking about that a lot? And I said, you're right. It's a terrible thing for a kid to have to worry about, but it's a part of the system now. So even for students, we found that when we switched to a gameful assessment system, we confused a lot of them. They had an idea it might be good for them, might be better than the other system, but they didn't know what to do, especially the high-achieving students. So students who'd always gotten A's were the most put out by this, right? Because we moved their cheese. They knew how to get an A, and they knew how to beat higher ed. It's not such a hard game to beat, frankly. And we had made it, in their perception, harder for them to be better than everybody else. In a system where everybody can achieve at the same level, that can appear problematic to some learners. But we built GradeCraft to try to solve this. Now, like I said, I'm going to skip over these slides so I can talk to you about Quest to Learn. And there's some other places where GradeCraft is explained if you're watching this on YouTube or something and you want to know more about GradeCraft. I gave a talk about this at SI last Tuesday, and that's somewhere on the SI website right now. But GradeCraft, the whole idea of it is to try to put some of this back in the command of the learners. And we're doing research on the features of GradeCraft right now to try to understand how the features. So I'm not using badges, but in other classes right now, in other classes I mentioned is using leaderboards. We want to see, for instance, in a class with a lot of assignments and a lot of assignment feedback, does the kind of feedback you get matter? So we can use text analytics, for instance, and see, like, does giving a lot of feedback matter more for motivation than giving very little feedback? How about if it's friendly or neutral, or very little if it's going to be negative in tone? But and things like progress feedback, things like the grade predictor is a kind of progress feedback, but other kinds of progress feedback. How does that help you stay engaged? So we'll talk more about GradeCraft as we go on because you guys are guinea pigs in that environment too. I think it has less impact on a graduate course the way I've designed it than it will on either of the undergrad classes. But there are 2 undergrad classes using it right now. One is an Intro to Computer Programming class here in SI. The other is an Intro to Political Theory class. We've actually got 7 students taking both classes, a very small sort of cross-comparative sample. But we're surveyed them on their learning motivation, goal versus mastery. And we're going to be looking at how that changes. We're going to be looking at their effort, and we're going to be looking at how they use GradeCraft as well. All right, one quick example of a school that is completely reformulated to do this. So you can go to this website, q2l.org, and see more of the design materials behind the school. But here's a quick overview video just to give you some sense of it.
Schools change very slowly. They're one of the most conservative institutions on the planet. And technology changes ever so fast. And there is a disconnect there.
There's been a lot of attention paid over the past couple of years to the notion of bringing technology into schools. And we discovered very quickly that actually doesn't make much of a difference if you just bring a laptop into a school.
Katie Salen is a professional game designer who helped found Quest to Learn. Quest to Learn is a one-year-old public middle school in New York City where the curriculum is based on video games.
And so it's a school that uses digital media as part of the curriculum. And it's also a school that's been designed from the ground up around the intrinsic qualities of games as learning spaces. So that doesn't mean that kids are playing video games all day, but it does mean that the learning at Quest to Learn is structured in a game-like way.
If I said to somebody, oh, my students are playing video games in school, yes, but we're not playing video games. We're actually building video games. And there's a distinction.
Well, we make our own. We also play others to get inspiration. And we also kind of like try to modify, as we call it, mod other games.
We are building our own world. But we're doing it in teams. So kids are assuming roles. Who's the set designer? Who's the writer? Who's the director? Who's the costume designer? Who's the script writer? So all of those roles that these kids assume force them to work collaboratively. So it allows us to sort of take knowledge from one domain and express it in another, which is the definition of higher order thinking. We say that a game is a system, and systems are made of parts, and those parts are related to each other.
Space goals. Components, core mechanics.
When we look at fractions as a system that has components, the numerator, the denominator. How do those components relate? What happens when you change one? So systems thinking is really our curriculum, which is based on New York State standards, and it's a very deep and rich way of looking at the world.
What we're really studying is like systems thinking and stuff, so if you're ever going to build like, I don't know, like any sort of system, you would know how and you would know why it works, and if you would observe anything, you would know why it works.
I knew that there was going to be like game-like learning and that we would learn game design. And there would be a lot of media involved, and I really like those kind of things. So I was really excited to hear that, and I right away said, I'm going here. And I'm having a great time and learning a lot of stuff, only in a funner way.
To me, one of the fascinating things is that he is, totally engaged. And doesn't want to.
I want to point out that Aviv is not totally representative because his dad has a freaking Emmy.
We learn a lot of things about every other subject in other school, but also computers for them and games and movies for them is a non-issue. Just like a tool.
Tools like video games have become important enough that researchers are trying to figure out how they can help in all classrooms. At NYU, Jan Klaus and a group of kids are trying to identify what makes commercial games so engaging.
It used to be that games were looked at as the time waster, just violent. And now I think the public begins to understand that there is a whole variety of different game genres and begins to understand that this is such a popular medium that this might actually be something that helps us learn.
All right, so we'll come back and hear more about Jan. Jan and I actually have a project together right now funded by the Gates Foundation. And the slides on this project are at the end. I'm going to not have time today, but in 2 weeks we're going to talk about research. That's actually a better place for me to talk about that study and how we're designing it. But this is how the curriculum works at Quest to Learn. It's not just about games. It's integrating all the domains. So they broke down the standard content areas and recombined them in ways that they thought made more sense. So for instance, Code Worlds is an integration of English language arts and math. Both are a kind of a code, right? Learning how to decode it and use it. There is game design and media arts. They call that sports for the mind. Being, space, and place is English language arts and social studies combined. Science and math combined and the way things work. They have a sort of a socio and emotional learning and a social networking space called Being Me. This covers all of the curricular elements that are required in the New York State standards from a different perspective. And they design different ways to engage with them. So first, rather than semesters, they have missions that take about 10 weeks. There are quests within those missions or subunits, but this is not just simple labeling. This is a meaningful redesign in that at the end, instead of having an exam, you have a boss level. And what they do in the boss level is they actually give the students a problem they've never seen before. Most tests give you problems in the order in which you learned them, from hard to or from easy to hard. In this case, it's a problem that you've never learned before, but all game designers know that in a boss level, the goal is to give people a new problem, but for which the player understands they've already gotten all the sub-skills they should have to accomplish this hard problem. It's a recombination task. It's a far transfer task, right? It's learning how to take what you already know and reapply it to a new challenging situation. That's awesome and difficult and makes the boss level a much better kind of exam. And there's a little reading about this that I'll make available to you guys, sort of breaking down the boss level. So that works really well for them. And they've got these sort of different environments for working. Some are regular classrooms like what you saw in the video, but others are sort of mixed reality environments and the social networking plans and the mission lab where they actually have brought working game designers into the school from Katie Salen's game design organization, and the kids can actually work together with the game designers on the real world games they're working on and enlist those people in helping them work on some of their projects. How does it do? I downloaded the school report card last week from the New York Public School Board website. You can do this too. They're doing pretty well, actually. Student performance is high. The school environment does pretty well. Progress is a little lower, but progress is a funny measure. This is the annual yearly progress kind of measure. It's how well are they moving all the subgroups up every year. So a C is not an unusual grade there for a high-performing school. Overall a B, and they get a proficient grade for their quality. So they're doing fine, right? Their students perform about as well on the New York standardized tests as other students. And you may say, but shouldn't they be doing way better? I mean, wasn't that the whole point of this? Well, one of the things to keep in mind is there are all these hard to measure intangible things going on about leadership, about collaboration, about creativity that are not covered in any of the standards or any of the assessments, where one might argue that Quest to Learn is actually doing a whole lot better. So we're about out of time. We're going to come back to this study in the future. For people watching this later, this is how I operate. Always run out of time. Anyway, the question, right, that the class is based on, are games transformative? So remember this table from last week from the 21st century standards and assessment idea? So we struggled a little bit last week thinking about different learning environments that we had seen so far, trying to slot them into different ones of these blocks, right, and saying, well, does it support, conflict resolution? Well, maybe, I don't know. Hey, how about Quandary? Does Quandary support learning about conflict resolution? You betcha, right? The games that we saw today, maybe not every game in all areas, but across different areas, do a far better job of addressing some of these challenges, some of these challenging outcomes than anything else we've seen so far, and I would wager than most standard curricula. So that should leave you thinking hard about this, are games transformative learning environments? The potential is very high, right? The problems are present, right, and are not going away on their own. So that's where we have to come in as designers of learning environments and start to think about ways to take what the potential is and make it possible for games to really amp up the capability of our learning environments to lead to all these kinds of outcomes. Okay, so that brings us to the end. Thank you.